Might have been back in the day something that, Paulus would scan your website out externally. Tell us what your current view is of this thing that's got to be managed, the attack surface.
We don't have a homogeneous way that, attackers both initially gain access and then start moving towards their target. And so the attack surface is all about those pieces together and how we protecting them.
I often think of the two different things you're defending against. One are just literally random attacks.
You're talking about the type of attackers, and you've got the opportunistic, the scan, discover, okay, now I'm going to chase this down. That also part of that is economically motivated, right?
When you talk to security leaders today, what do you see them doing to encompass the full breadth of their attack surface?
People are moving away from, oftentimes the attack surface exposure management comes out of vulnerability management. It's a mature space. We understand it. We scan stuff, we find CVEs, we try and patch them.
Hello, and welcome to the Security Strategist podcast, where we have a weekly conversation with people impacting the enterprise tech landscape. My name is Richard Stiennon. I'm an industry analyst and author. I advise enterprises, vendors, and investors on the entire cybersecurity industry. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Craig Roberts, Principal Software Engineer at Rapid7. We'll be unpacking the evolving complexities around digital exposure, especially the escalating challenges of attack surface management. From hidden vulnerabilities to misconfigurations, today's digital environment is fraught with blind spots. Our discussion will focus on how organizations can better understand, prioritize, and ultimately manage their growing attack surfaces. Welcome, Craig.
Hi, Richard. Thanks for having me.
Hey, Craig, give us a feel for your background and how you ended up at Rapid7.
Yeah, sure. So I've been in the security operations incident response space for about 10 years before, and actually was part of the founding team of a company called Noetic, which is an attack surface management company, startup. And Rapid7 acquired Noetic in the middle of last year. So we started Noetic in 2020. So we've been thinking about this problem with a lot of interesting people for a good 5 years now. So yeah, that's kind of my journey on the way here. And I think one of the interesting things I always try and share is, the reason we started Noetic was the outcome of that security operations and incident response experience that, so many of these incidents came from, the box that didn't have EDR on, or the server that wasn't being vulnerability scanned and patched, and so was exploitable. And so I think that's what we set out to do, was kind of raise that hygiene bar. So I'm a big proponent of like pragmatic security, through preventative controls.
Awesome. I always like that Noetic name because it means pure intellect. And it's always just a really good Greek root, I think. So every time I hear attack surface management mentioned, it's in the context of, new attack surfaces that we have to worry about. It might have been back in the day something that, Paulus would scan your website out externally. And then we thought about, the rest of where the actual network, corporate network is exposed, but it goes way beyond that. Tell us what your current view is of this thing that's got to be managed, the attack surface.
It's all about the kind of different steps an attacker takes, right? If we're talking about the attack surface, it's what as an attacker can I exploit to get to my goal and align to my mission. And so for, to step through a full attack cycle, oftentimes I'm going to move around the enterprise, right? Move around an organization, and that will go through various different things, bits, pieces, whatever we want to call them. And I think as a result, that is where the attack surface comes in, is that we don't have a homogeneous way that, attackers both initially gain access and then start moving towards their target. And so the attack surface is all about those pieces together, and how we protecting them. Do we understand what different exposures we might have that an attacker might exploit as part of that? I mean, I'll pick up there, Richard, that you were saying about the external attack surface. And I think when people talk about attack surface, that's their initial reaction. I was at a conference this week even, and, people came over and, attack surface, you do attack surface. Okay, cool. Yeah, we're interested in scanning our external footprint. And that's only a small piece of it these days, right? I think it's a valid piece, it's an important piece, it's often where an attacker will start. But it doesn't, it is an initial foothold. It is, everything past that point is also still attack surface. It's still things we need to understand, manage, monitor, and protect. And so I think that piece from a external to the internal transition to how am I joining that external world into my actual enterprise, and can I put the two together? That's an important piece. And then, it's not going to be a security podcast without talking about AI and the changes there. But I think there's a lot of different attack surfaces. Obviously, over the past 5, 10, 15 years, you look at the cloud space, hyperscalers. We've taken our hosting out of our own corporate data center, and we've moved it across different services that we don't necessarily have the full control of from a security and a depth perspective. And so that's another part of that attack surface. And those aren't, classic attack vectors in historical circumstances. But in modern day enterprises, cloud is a huge attack vector for organizations. It's a huge source of risk. And then you move on to things like identities, things like software supply chain. All of these are kind of piling one on top of the other. And as I say, that the attack surface is not this kind of uniform. It's able to be exploited because it is all these individual pieces. And if I can just kind of use, get the holes of Swiss cheese to line up, then I can achieve my aim. So, yeah.
Or I often think of the two different things you're defending against. One are just literally random attacks, right? You're attacked because you have exposure. Somebody finds you on Shodan and, they're a vulnerable system. Let's go exploit it. And the language you've been using sounds mostly like you're describing targeted attacks, right? They decide that you're a target of interest, it could be ransomware that they're going after, but it could be they actually want to steal your information. And that's where I think you get into the nitty gritty and beyond the hygiene, right? Of course, you don't want a third party risk management company to scan your website and give you an F for security. Those are usually straightforward things to fix. But on top of that, you want an attacker just not to find anything at all when they start poking around. So they go on to the next thing, right? Decide that it's too expensive.
You're talking about the type of attackers, and you've got that opportunistic, the scan, discover, okay, now I'm going to, chase this down. That also part of that is economically motivated, right? If we look at commodity threat, it's all economic motivations. If I'm harder to exploit an attack, that's a waste of my time as an attacker. I'm much better chasing after someone who's going to be much easier to exploit. And so I think that's also where, as you say, that the better our control of our attack surface is, the less, the more they're going to have to economically invest in the attack. There's lots of organizations that face persistent attacks from non-economically motivated, threat actors. But at the same time, I think you can take a lot of commodity threat off the table by, as you say, having that initial high bar to kind of discourage.
Yeah. When you talk to security leaders today, what do you see them doing to, encompass the full breadth of their attack surface?
People are moving away from, oftentimes the attack surface exposure management comes out of vulnerability management, right? We've been doing vulnerability management for a number of years. It's a mature space. We understand it. We scan stuff. We find CVEs. We try and patch them. There's too many CVEs now, so we do our best to patch as many as we can that we think are relevant on the assets that we think are important to our environment. And I think that's the best thing you can do today is focus on the prioritization. And so that's what I see a lot of leaders looking for is, no realistic organization is going to have zero vulnerabilities. And so what are the ones I do care about? What are the ones I don't care about? If they're not exploitable and they're, you need root on the box to start to exploit it, that's a level deeper. And, depending on what asset it's based on as well, I care about it more or less. And then the other important part we've been looking at a lot recently is the mitigations on a device. Does it have EDR or some form of protection on device so that if this exploit was, the CVE was exploited, can we mitigate that with other controls without having to do the patching? And so I think looking at that prioritization piece, leaders are under a lot of economic pressure, or have been, at least in the past kind of couple of years. And so how do I more efficiently take care of that kind of risk piece? But I think people are looking beyond that kind of vulnerability, scope. CVEs are very important to our industry and how we categorize, process, and remediate exploits and problems. But as I said, there's a whole host of cloud misconfigurations, right? They don't have a CVE. And so what do we do? Do we put them in our cloud security team or our DevOps team? Where does that sit? Who owns closure of that and what process? And in my mind, a lot of the process is very similar to a CVE or vulnerability management problem. And so by streamlining a lot of those together, it's probably going to be the same people fixing it. If I'm changing a misconfiguration, it's the same as, maybe patching this box or changing this network firewall rule or whatever it might be. And so actually streamlining those together can help us prioritize amongst the kind of superset of exposures.
And on top of all of that, I see two major areas where there aren't any CVEs. Of course, 0 days. They haven't been assigned those yet. And the sophisticated attackers are going to be going after those. Maybe they'll be, I'm going to use AI here. I'll introduce AI. Maybe the attackers will have access to tools that find those for them. And then the whole world of IoT, right? Things that are really hard to patch. You can't put an agent on them. And there'll be vulnerabilities in all of them, almost immediately as soon as they're shipped, and they never get categorized and slapped with a CVE. So, and that just extends the attack surface deeper and deeper.
Yeah, and the reaction to that as well, as you said, it's that's not software patching, right? We've got to then look at what other mitigations can we put in place for those type of networks or those type of devices. I think the 0 day is a great example. We've seen in the past month. One of the really fortunate differences between working at a little startup and working at an industry titan like Rapid7 is the research team here, and having contact with them is phenomenal to see their process. But the amount of rumors we get about disclosures of vulnerabilities, before they hit, hey, there's probably something going on, and it comes through various groups, through different clients, through exploits that we see on our managed services, right? We see attacks from hundreds of customers who are, we're running their security. And so I think from that, these 0 days, it's more about how can I effectively search and quarantine off where these software or these devices may be in my environment. As I say, we've seen a huge uptick in edge device attacks. That's a real area of focus. Again, I was this week at the UK government's conference I was at. It was on everyone's lips all the time, right? Because they're such a juicy target, internet facing the whole time. Their specialized operating systems are generally not heavily monitored, and they're really hard to do forensics on. They're almost impossible to do forensic analysis. So you can exploit, and then it's very hard to learn how those techniques were used so that we can defend and protect. And so we're seeing this kind of, I don't know exactly how I feel about it yet, but this change where some vendors aren't disclosing CVEs because they're worried they release a patch, it gets reversed very quickly now, especially with the advent of AI, right? I don't know anything about, device level firmware for load balancers, but I can probably use some of the tools I have in my box to be able to reverse the patch and figure out what that is trying to fix, and maybe write an exploit for it. And so as part of that, we've got to think about how as a community, as an industry, we come together to say, these 0 day threats, how do we process those quickly, release them, and then defend against them? Because once they come out, 1 or 2 days, the level of exploitation just from kind of the weaponization and the efficient weaponization, right? Of okay, let's start scanning, let's start finding, let's start exploiting. So, a really interesting space there that again CVEs don't cover, and that's where you've got to have control of your data to understand. Okay, where can I find this? Not in a classic CVE sense.
Yep. So talk about the actual management of this, right? So it's one thing to find your assets, find their vulnerabilities, but what's the a good approach to managing it, right? So you have to start somewhere. You have to decide what's the critical stuff to work on because there's too many to work on everything. It's extremely difficult. As a matter of fact, my kind of baby steps when I became an industry analyst, there was a new critical vulnerability in Solaris for Sun Microsystems. So I scrambled and I issued a warning to all of Gartner's customers that they should patch immediately, right? Something that we hear from CISA every day now. And the first call I had was with a CIO, and he said, "You're an idiot. We've got 2,000 Sun systems, and we have to schedule them a week in advance to take them down, to update them. And it'll take, 3 months to do 2,000 servers. But in that 3-month period, there'll be multiple new critical vulnerabilities. So quit saying that stuff." And ever since, I've learned to identify the newbies in the industry, like the head of CISA, who just jump on that bandwagon as if there was some secret button you push and you get patched. Doesn't work that way.
Yeah, and even if there was, right? Even if there was a secret technology button, the business can't deal with that. If I tried to use my debit card in a credit card in a shop and it's like, "Oh, you can't use your card for 30 minutes because we've got to patch all of these boxes at the same time with no overlapping patch window," like customers aren't going to take that and your business isn't going to take that. So I absolutely,
And on top of that, SolarWinds has demonstrated that installing updates could be the most dangerous thing you do because it could be malicious updates. So I've been advising people ever since SolarWinds is don't be patient zero, delay as long as you possibly can, because that's the only way you're going to find out today. So, well, talk to me about that management issue and prioritization.
Yeah, I mean, the prioritization piece, I think especially when you look at the more classic kind of CVE space, people fall over themselves to rescore vulnerabilities. And, I think there's some great industry metrics in there. Obviously, CISA Kev has really had an impact generally of what's above that threshold of, and it's not just the celebrity CVE that has a cute logo, right? It's things we've seen that we can't tell you why we've seen, but you should care about them. And I think that's a great leading indicator. You look at other open source programs like First EPSS, the exploit prediction score, which is going to tell you how likely that CVE is to be exploited. None of these are perfect, but I think they're great leading indicators, especially when you start stacking this. Whenever you start stacking data, you increase its kind of quality, especially from differing views. So I think taking that into account and then, you're starting to get to the right place. But people fall over themselves to do all this calculation, and then they treat all of the CVEs across their infrastructure in a binary way because they don't have good visibility of the assets that they reside on. And I think that's where I really have a kind of a lesson that the asset is a really important thing, and how important that is to your business and what data it has on it and what mitigations it has on it hugely affects and varies the risk of that actual vulnerability. And I think people often over-rotate hugely on rescoring vulnerabilities, creating this, vulnerability intelligence pipeline or whatever to figure out. And I think that's all great. And then you ask them, hey, if you can only patch 10 boxes, which are the 10 boxes with this vulnerability would you patch? And the answer's, I'm not sure, because our CMDB has a terrible asset understanding of our environment. And so, as I joke often, we wouldn't have built a business if CMDBs were effective, because, cyber teams need a different type of asset understanding so that they can apply that vulnerability lens over the top to say, hey, as you said, everyone's stretched. What do we do first? And especially when we talk about those time critical windows, what am I going to do first? Because even if the patch takes, 10 minutes for each one, those 10 minutes are going to make a difference if it's on, 10,000 machines, right? One of them starts on Monday, one of them is going to finish on Sunday, and which do I want to have done in that window?
So that's the visibility part. You think it's one thing, you can't even begin to understand the vulnerabilities until you've identified all the assets and know where they sit as far as who they're visible to, right? They can be visible to only you. That's great. but the whole world could see them as well, or somebody who got access to this server could see all the rest. And you have to know all that. You have to map the visibility.
Yeah, and those relationships as well, right? And again, we talk about those sliding doors of attack surfaces, and that's the other part of it. Is if I can use a cloud misconfiguration to access your cloud account, and then use some credentials that have been left in a bucket there to then log into through your identity provider, and then traverse onto your on-premise state, and then use classic vulnerability exploits. I'm really going through those different attack surfaces. And we're only seeing a small part of those if we think about the kind of attack surface space as, either just CVE led or just external surface led, because all of those together are what presents the risk, and the high level of prevention I can have across those different tools. Now, each of them requires a different approach, right? I'm not going to use the same approach for patching an exploit in a box than from a cloud misconfiguration, and maybe the tooling or the technology is different, but the data that comes out of them should just be treated very similarly. This is an exposure. Where does that exposure reside? The exposure may be on a user, it may be on a cloud account, it may be on a server. But treating that in a more kind of generic way, I think, allows you to prioritize those more effectively, especially, as you say, when you're looking at the asset specific or kind of object specific attachment of them, because it's tough enough with the vulnerability piece, but then if you are trying to run a whole separate program to look after some of those other attack surfaces as well, I think you can really start to see a huge human load required and effort required to mitigate. And at the end of the day, that just means you're going to close a smaller amount of risk across those different pillars. Yeah. Got
it. So, Craig, if you could summarize one takeaway in 60 seconds from our conversation today for CISOs, what would it be and why?
I think having all of your data is a really key part. We talked about visibility and we kind of skated over that, but having the understanding of your environment across all of your assets and things that will have security impact, your cloud, your users, and then layering and thinking about exposures rather than CVEs, right? Your cloud misconfigurations, your identity, MFA, misconfigurations, along with those CVE and zero-day pieces as well. And treating those in a similar way, because at the end of the day, we need to prioritize all of those exposures, because the attacker isn't going to care the weapon they use, right? They're not going to care which of those particular exposures they exploit. And so we need to make sure we're treating them all kind of equally from a risk perspective, relevant to where they apply. So I think focus on where those exposures are rather than the, scoring systems within. That would be my key piece. And that underlying trust in data. We have so many different vendors within security stacks, within security teams. You need to have those vendors talking, that data being shared and able to look at other vendors' data in other vendors' tools, because ultimately you're going to have to pull that together to get that central view. And so I think that the security industry's gone a long way to that with APIs and data sharing, but I think that's a key part as well, is this isn't a siloed opportunity.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Craig, for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking the time to come on, and thank you to everyone listening. We hope you found today's episode valuable and took away some great insights. For more information on what we're talking about, be sure to visit rapid7.com. We'll be back next week with another episode in our podcast series. In the meantime, don't forget to subscribe on all major platforms. Enjoy the conversation on our socials at EM360Tech on Twitter and LinkedIn. For even more great content, visit us on em360tech.com.